So as I'm easing into this morning, I kind of wonder if you've had this experience. I think a lot of us have had this experience where you've been caught in a lie. Okay? Caught in a lie, and instead of just owning it, you actually just sort of doubled down and tried to convince them it wasn't a lie, even though you knew it was a lie. And so that reminded me of one of my favorite Bree stories. And I'm going to pause here because now I can get the TV up and running. It's HDMI 1, right? I'm hopefully going to impress you all. Hey, there we go. All right. Yeah. I do know how to work a TV, even on the spot under pressure like this. But that reminds me of one of my favorite Bree stories. Okay, so Bree is our oldest daughter, and she's all grown up now. She has a family of her own. She lives in Indiana. In fact, our two oldest daughters, Bree, Sophie, and our grandson Miles, have been with us this week. In fact, they're going to be with us in the second service today, and it's been awesome. But since Bree was going to be with us, I decided I better get her permission before I share this story with you. So I got her permission. But when Bree was like 10 or 11 years old, we had just picked her up from a week at church camp. And she had an awesome week at church camp. And one of the things that she got to experience while she was there was like this special activity where they were given some wilderness skills training, right? And one of the things included like learning how to start a campfire, which apparently she had been really good at. And she was very proud of that fact. We heard all about it on the drive home from camp. And then a few days later, Bree and her sister Sophie and their friend were playing in the backyard. They'd spent the whole day out there, and then their friend got picked up. And a short time later, we got a phone call from the friend's dad. And it was one of those like one concerned parent to another kind of phone calls. And he was very, very gracious, but he said, I really don't want to get her in trouble. I hope this doesn't get her in trouble, but I just thought you should know that apparently, while the girls were playing outside this afternoon, Bree started a little fire in the backyard. And, as a dad, I'm like, a little impressed. I'm like, hey, apparently she is pretty good at this. But at the same time, we can't have our kids like starting fires that we don't know about. And so we were like, okay, we got to talk to Bree about this. But Amanda and I, we decided, let's not just come at it directly. Let's see if we can drop some hints, and let's just see if she'll come forward with it. So that was our strategy, and we were all standing in the kitchen, and Bree was there, just very casually. Amanda sort of led into this, and she was like, hey, earlier today, I thought I smelled some smoke outside. Anybody else smell any smoke? And I'm playing along. I'm like, yeah, I think I smelled some smoke too. Bree? And she's playing it off. She's like, oh, I didn't smell anything. That's weird. Like, yeah, that is kind of weird because it seemed like it was coming from the backyard and you girls were out there for a long time. I figured you probably would have smelled that. No, I don't know what you're talking about. And she wasn't budging. And so finally I decided I just got to come at this directly. You're going to take the direct approach. And I said, Bree, did you start a fire in the backyard earlier today? And her response was so classic. She said, oh, Dad, that would be so dangerous. I would never do that, Dad. And the best part, she said, I am way too mature for that. And I can't remember if we just like cracked up right then and there or if we kept it together and then lost it later. But it's like, here's our daughter, fresh off a week of church camp. And she's lying straight to our faces like a boss, And so at this point, we're like, okay, we got to talk about the fire. Now we got to talk about the lying. And, so we had a good conversation about all that. But I'm not picking on Bree this morning because the reality is that's not just a kid thing. That's really a human thing. Right? When we find ourselves in these moments, it's like we got to explain ourselves. And we've got to try to make our case, even when we know that the facts aren't always on our side. And sometimes we don't even know we're doing this. And I'll give you kind of an example of what I'm talking about with this. Maybe we can have a little bit of fun with this. But I discovered some time ago through the help of social media that there's something called girl math. Anyone ever heard of girl math? We've used girl math, maybe. Maybe you know about this. Apparently, it's a real thing. And so with the help of the internet, I came up with some examples of how girl math actually works. And I put this so you can see how this adds up, right? So I see something on sale, and I buy it because it's on sale, right? Not necessarily because you needed it or because you were going to buy it anyway, but just because it's on sale. And that equals I saved money. That's girl math, right? That's how girl math works, apparently. Okay, I'm not making this up. Here's another example. I returned an item for $50. I bought another item for $50. That item was free. Girl math. It's brilliant. It doesn't necessarily add up, but that's how it works. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's also dad math, okay? And so here's how dad math works in my world, at least how I calculate travel times and things like that. A couple of scenarios, right? Scenario one, we leave at 3 p.m., we hit bad traffic, and we arrive at 6 p.m. Scenario two, we stay until 7, so we kind of let the traffic die down, we hit better traffic, and then we arrive at 8:30 p.m. According to dad math, scenario two saves time. It makes time. It makes better time, right? Even though you arrive 2.5 hours later, it doesn't actually make sense, but that's how it adds up for me and my dad math mind. Last example, because maybe you didn't know this, but there is also such a thing as pastor math. Okay, and here's how pastor math works for those who don't know. A 30-minute message, which is always my target, is anything less than 40 minutes. And 500 attendance is basically 1,000. That's pastor math, right? That's how that works. And maybe we laugh at this because, on some level we all do it. We stretch things just a little bit. We round things up, we soften things down just to feel better about the story we're telling. And for a lot of us, this is just normal, right? And that's where the real tension is for all of us in this, is because we live in a world where nuance and exaggeration and half-truths often replace what's actually true. And so facts get spun. And truths get managed. And over time, it gets harder and harder to tell what's real and what's been adjusted or doctored or cooked just a little bit. And after all, it's only a lie if you get caught. And this is just how the world works. And so while dishonesty in some ways has become normalized as a society, we very naturally become very distrustful of pretty much anyone and everyone, which is why you now need like 17 different ways to prove your identity at the DMV. It's annoying, right? It's why you have to have more than like 2 or 3 stage of verification and security to get into your online apps, which you paid for, right? It's like facial recognition and fingerprint scanning is not even enough anymore. It's also why you get stopped at Walmart as you're walking out to show your receipts. It's just a box of Little Debbie's. It's in the bag. I came straight from the checkout lane. And you still got to check to make sure I actually paid for it. True story. But it's frustrating, right? It's frustrating, but we've adapted to a world where words are cheap. And if we're honest, sometimes ours are too. And when some level of deception just becomes the expectation, think about how this influences our relationships. When we're constantly wondering and we're questioning, who can I really trust? When I know deep down that even I'm not always very trustworthy. And so it's in moments like this when we start to see this in ourselves that I find myself drawn back to the mountain. Back to the mountain. For me, this title is just layered with meaning. In fact, it was inspired by my time away in Kenya just a few weeks ago. So our hotel in Nakuru was situated on the side of a small little mountain, kind of overlooking part of the Great Rift Valley with Lake Nakuru kind of sprawled out below. And so every morning, most mornings, I would sit out on our patio, the patio right outside of my hotel room, and I'd have this view in front of me. And I'd sit there looking at this view. I'd have a cup of Kenya's finest instant coffee, and I'd sit there with my journal open, and I would just reflect on the words that Jesus spoke in a setting that was very similar to this one, almost 2,000 years ago. And his words are captured for us by one of his first followers, a former tax collector named Matthew. And Matthew 5, chapter 5, verse 1 opens like this. Here's what Matthew writes for us. He says, "Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them." And then what unfolds from there, and what follows this, is what's considered to be basically Jesus' definitive collection of teachings that we know as his Sermon on the Mount. And it's what one pastor and scholar described as the nearest thing to a manifesto that Jesus ever uttered. For it is his own description of what he wanted his followers to be and do. And so for the past few months, I've just been slowly making my way through his mountainside teaching, sitting with my own thoughts and reflections that I've kept in a series of journal entries. And so over the next few weeks, what I'd like to do is sort of take us through a portion of this iconic sermon that Jesus gave, with a series of messages that are inspired by some of those journal entries. And so back to the mountain, it might stir different images and thoughts for me like it does for some of you, but more than anything, it's an invitation to return to the original teaching of Jesus and recapture his way of life for our lives. And so we're dropping in somewhere around the middle of his teaching, starting in Matthew chapter 5, verse 33. This is where we're going to begin. And look at what Jesus says here. He says, again, you have heard that it was said. Now, I want to pause here for just a moment because actually, even in just this very short phrase, we get a sense of what Jesus is actually trying to do with this teaching, because he's taking well-known principles that they were all familiar with and he's drawing them in, right? He's done this a number of times already. That we skipped over some of those parts. He's going to do it a few more times, as we'll see in the coming weeks. But he leads into this like, you've heard it said. And then right as they're nodding in agreement, then he comes back with this. He says, but I say to you. And then he just sort of completely flips it upside down to help us see something deeper underneath. And I said, we bypassed the first third of his teaching. We bypassed it for now. I'm sure we'll come back to it some other time in another teaching series probably. But in the meantime, I just encourage you to go home and read the Sermon on the Mount for yourself in its entirety. Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. Just read it straight through. And if you're a follower of Jesus, this is the perfect way to familiarize yourself with the way of Jesus through his teaching. And if you're here this morning and you're still exploring faith, and you want to get to know Jesus, what better place to start than with this, as you get to know him and see what he's all about. It's all right there in his Sermon on the Mount. So go home and read it, but I'm warning you, it will challenge you. It will challenge you to the core. I mean, Jesus will challenge how you understand a blessed life. He'll he'll challenge how you see yourself. He'll challenge how you approach the scriptures. He'll challenge your thought life, your prayer life. He'll challenge your views on human sexuality. I mean, Jesus speaks directly to all of these things in the Sermon on the Mount, and I promise you, not all of it is easy to digest. But here's the beauty in it. Because in his grace, no matter where you are, whether you agree with everything he says or not, Jesus will continue to draw you closer, and he will call you to more. He will call you to something far more rewarding, more life-giving. In fact, that's what he's doing right here. He's sort of deconstructing the religiosity of his original audience so that he can reconstruct a life that actually reflects his kingdom. And so then we go back to the words of Jesus here, Matthew chapter 5, verse 33. We'll finish this verse here. Here's what Jesus says. He says, again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord your vows you have made. Now here, Jesus is actually summarizing several passages from the Hebrew scriptures, right? What we have in our Old Testament in the Bible. And everyone listening to Jesus at this point would have been tracking with him. Like, yes, of course, Jesus, we know exactly what you're talking about. We've heard this many times before. Solid teaching so far. Keep going. And then he comes back with this. But I tell you, and here's the plot twist, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. And so as I read this, I actually think it's a little bit funny. Like, I imagine people swearing by all these things, like, I swear by heaven, I swear by Jerusalem, by the beard of Zeus. It's like they're grabbing at anything and everything they can think of just to make themselves sound more believable. And then Jesus starts talking about swearing by your head, and now I think he's starting to mess with us a little bit. Because it's like, Jesus, what are you talking about? You can't make even one hair white or black. And I'm like, Jesus, what are you trying to say? I'm going to try not to take this personally, because even though I have a lot more white hair now than I do black hair, not by choice, you know? And so I kind of feel like maybe Jesus is just sort of making a little jab at the older guys in the group, you know, hey, by the way, you really can't do anything about this. I suppose I could color my hair to get back to that dark head of hair that I had in my 20s. That would be weird though, wouldn't it? If I just showed up all of a sudden with anyway, side note, that wasn't even in my notes. So Jesus is messing with them a little bit. But it makes you wonder, why would somebody feel the need to do this in the first place? By like swearing by all these things, if their word was enough. And isn't that really why something like an oath even exists? Because again, we know that human beings, at the end of the day, we can't always be trusted. So we've got to have these kind of like binding agreements to try to lock people in. And so we swear by all sorts of things. We promise, make big, bold promises over and over again. But the irony with this picture is that anytime somebody does this, it doesn't actually make them seem more credible. It actually makes them more suspicious, doesn't it? It's like, what are you trying to hide? What are you trying to compensate for here that you have to go to such effort? But there's actually something far more deceptive in this that Jesus wants to confront and dismantle in the life of his followers. Because the Pharisees, who were basically the religious authorities, right? They were the teachers of the law. They had all sorts of tricks to sort of sidestep the truth, right? Like if they needed to get out of something, or if they needed to bend the truth a little bit, or they needed to kind of back out of a commitment without looking bad, they had all sorts of tricks to do this, and how they used oaths was one of them. Because according to their custom, if it wasn't sworn explicitly in the name of God, then it wasn't technically binding. Right? And so they would come really close by using all these other things. I mean, heaven and earth and Jerusalem and on and on and on. And this was like their loophole. It was basically them saying, like we used to say when we were kids, oh, my fingers were crossed. That didn't count. My fingers were crossed. My eyes were crossed. My toes were crossed. Like whatever. You know, we'd get out of it that way. And so even among God's people within the community of faith, taking oaths had been reduced to a game of when it was okay to lie, when it was okay to break a promise, and when it wasn't. And so Jesus is saying, you guys, your logic is as flawed as your character at this point. Because you think you're sidestepping this by not explicitly swearing to God's name, but all of these other things that you're using are under God's authority. You're just abusing the system now. And so he flips it on him. He's like, don't even make an oath at all. Just don't even do it at all. In other words, stop swearing falsely, right? Stop using words to create a version of reality that's not even true. And Jesus wasn't actually saying that making oaths and taking vows are necessarily bad in and of themselves. That's not necessarily the problem. The problem is when we have to fortify our commitments by swearing on something or someone to manufacture some sense of credibility. That's the problem. And so, you know, one of the most common vows that many of us have taken in this room are our marriage vows, right? And those are good. We should keep doing that. We should keep those vows. But can you imagine going to a wedding and you hear the groom, I mean, it's time for the vows, and you hear the groom head into it with something like this: on my great-great-granddaddy's grave, by the stars in the sky, I do hereby pinky promise. Cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. Like, if the groom or anyone else, I mean the bride or whoever, like started going to all this before they even make their vows, we'd be sitting there thinking, okay, how serious are they about this? How long is this really going to last? And so Jesus says, rather than do this, here's what you do instead. And it's as revolutionary as it is remarkably simple. Here's what Jesus says in verse 37. All you need, he's talking to his followers, his disciples. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. rather than go to all the trouble of substantiating your words, swearing by this or that, making bold and outlandish oaths and promises. Just let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. Full stop. That's all you need. But here's the thing. Your word can only stand like that when your character supports it, when it's upheld by your integrity. And so the heart of the teaching here isn't really about oaths or vows at all. It's about living a life of integrity that eliminates the need to make them in the first place. It's about living with such integrity that your life would be so aligned with your values and belief that no one would ever feel the need to question your simple yes or no. And so really, this is what this all comes down to. What Jesus wants us to understand is that a life of integrity speaks for itself. A life of integrity speaks for itself. Now, I'm curious where you see yourself in the midst of all of this. Like as we made our way through just this very small part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where do you see yourself? Because I think it would be easy for any of us to look at this and say, you know what, I'm a pretty honest person. You know, I don't lie outright to people. I don't cheat. I don't steal. I'm not hurting anyone. Like, I'm doing all right. And that's probably true. But I wonder if this is one of those areas where Jesus wants to call us to more. And maybe there's something deeper that he wants to speak to and shape and form within our lives. And so I want to ask you these questions. And these are just some questions for all of us, every single one of us, to do a little personal self-reflection this morning. And so let's just ask yourself these questions. Do I overcommit to appear helpful, even when I know I can't follow through? Do I exaggerate details to make a story more interesting or impressive? Do I ever say things that are technically true, but intentionally misleading? Do I avoid hard conversations by saying what people want to hear instead of what's true? Is there an area where my words and my life are out of alignment right now? Now, if you're like me, there's maybe one or more of those questions that hit a little bit harder than you expected them to. And maybe you're looking at this or you're listening to these questions and you're thinking, oh yeah, okay, I struggle with that one. Or maybe, just recently I know I've done that one a few times. And if that's true, all that means is that there's still some growing that we have to do. And for the record, that's all of us, right? We all have some growing to do in these areas of our lives. So now let me ask you, what would it look like this week for your yes to be yes and your no to be no? What does that look like for you? And some of you might be thinking about this and thinking, wow, I know my work is cut out for me on this one, because I'm thinking through the spheres of my life, my closest relationships, my family. I'm thinking at home, I'm thinking in my neighborhood, I'm thinking at work, and I'm realizing that not everybody just accepts my yes or my no. I usually have to explain myself. I usually have to go a little bit further than that, and maybe that's for a reason. And you know what? If that's true for you, that's okay. But the question then is, now where do we start? Where do we start with this? And here's what I want to encourage you with and challenge you with, is that it's not with big promises. That's not where we start. But it's in everyday moments. Because I'm convinced that every single interaction in our life, like the conversations, the moments that our lives intersect with someone else, those interactions are really transactions of trust. And every transaction of trust will do one of three things. First of all, they lay the foundation. Right? These transactions of trust, they lay the foundation, because building a life of integrity is a long game. But it has to start somewhere. Right? So maybe it starts with a new friendship, maybe it's a reconciliation, or maybe it's just in a season where you're rebuilding your life. But it starts somewhere, and it starts with choosing to demonstrate your character through honesty and follow through. Your yes means yes, and your no means no. And if this has been a struggle for you, start now. Start in the very next interaction that you have with someone. In that transaction of trust, with Jesus' help, begin laying the foundation for a life of integrity. And that's what these transactions of trust, they do. First of all, they lay the foundation or they build on that foundation. Right? Because, integrity is built through consistency over time. It's one interaction after another. It's one kept word after another. It's one honest moment after another. And over time, that consistency then becomes credibility. But we all know that kind of credibility doesn't happen overnight. Again, it takes time. It happens over time. It's one transaction of trust after another, building a reputation for being a person of your word until eventually your word is all you need. And so it either lays the foundation or it builds on that foundation, or the third thing these transactions of trust do, tear it all down. They can tear it all down. And this is the other side of it that I know we've all experienced before. Because we know that one half-truth, one broken promise, one exaggeration, one lie is so often all it takes to break trust. And when trust is broken, the results and the impact is real and often devastating. Because that's when relationships begin to disintegrate. That's when marriages begin to unravel. That's when opportunities begin to erode and careers hit a dead end. All because trust at some point was broken. And so at this point, I think we need to ask ourselves, do I really want to go through this life? Do I want to be someone who has to prop up my words all the time? In every one of my relationships, that I have to be that person that's explaining myself and making promises just to substantiate my words. Do I want to be someone who's constantly second-guessed and scrutinized and kept at arm's length? Because there's no life in that, right? There's no freedom in that. There's no depth of community and relationship when that describes our life. And through his teaching on the mountain, Jesus shows us that's not who we are. That's not who we were meant to be. As his followers, he calls us to be people whose yes and no stand on their own. That's who we are. But that kind of life is built on the character of Jesus in us. His Spirit at work in us, forming us into his likeness and leading us into his way of life. A life that is only possible because of who Jesus is and what he's done for us. Because here's the truth, none of us lives this out perfectly. Right? We've all had moments where our yes didn't mean yes and our no didn't mean no. And if this message does anything, it should remind us not just of the standard that Jesus calls us to, but of the grace that he gives us when we fall short. Because when we look at the life of Jesus, we don't just see the one who taught this, but we see the one who lived it. In the garden, before his crucifixion, when everything in him wanted another way, Father, if there's any other way, he ultimately came back to this and said, yet not my will, but yours be done. That was his yes. And his yes meant yes. And on the cross, he followed through with everything he said he would do. And with his final breath, he said, it is finished. No exaggeration. No promise left unfulfilled. His life spoke for itself. And so today as we take communion, we remember that kind of faithfulness. We remember a Savior whose word can be trusted because his life backed it up all the way to the cross. So if you're a follower of Jesus with us this morning, regardless of your church background or affiliation, you're invited to participate in this with us. And while the song is being sung, just invite you to make your way to the front. Our elders will be positioned up here, and you can receive the bread and the cup and return to your seats. And then after the song, I'll come back up to close us and send you on your way. But over these next few moments, let's eat the bread that represents his body given for us. And let's drink the cup that represents his blood poured out for the forgiveness of our sins. And let's celebrate together the life that we now have with God, a life that we've been invited into and included in because of Jesus. Because Jesus said yes. He said yes to the Father, and he says yes to us, so that in him we can have life. Life eternal. Life with him that begins here and now. So let's celebrate that together.